Hello and welcome to another After Effects reproduction in Apple Motion 5. This time around, for our 10th project, the source graphic comes from motion designer David Roberts, and if you check out the link you will see that graphic roll in about the 12-minute 28-second mark. So let's check it out before we get into our project. And we've got this square element, which is like the main feature of this title graphic. It's going to rotate and scale in and then expand to give the main titles a banner as they roll in, and then drop down, and a lower flourish will sweep in and reveal the lower titles. And in the main titles we've got this dual effect of the stencil type working with the plain type all in the same space there. So for all of that happening, there's not a lot going on in the layers panel. We've got this clone layer to animate everything out, and coming into the main graphic we've got the lower titles in one group, and here in the main titles, if you've been doing a few of these with us by now, this should be looking really familiar. We've got the lead and follow groups, which is our masking build to give us the dual typography effect, and that square element, which is the main feature of this graphic, well, that just fit in perfectly with this build that we've been doing before. Alright then, so let's jump into the project and see how we put it all together. Right, so I'm just starting the project with a background. I've got a gradient generator sitting in this group. It's just running a diagonal gradient from dark to grey, just trying to keep a similar color profile to the source graphic. So the first thing we're going to do is add 3 groups and start that lead follow build. So I'll call this one here just main titles, and this one follow, and this one lead. So our square element is going to just be a part of this lead group. So with the lead group selected, I'll grab my line tool and I'm drawing from bottom up. I'm going to hold shift and drag up to make a line in the canvas. Please make sure you go from bottom up, otherwise some of the later instructions will give you different results. I'll just rename this line as our lead stencil, and with the line selected, come into the inspector, come to geometry and set it at -50 and 50, and come into the style panel. We'll give it a width of 100 and set the start and end cap to none. And then come into properties and reset the X and Y position to center it in the canvas. Okay, so now we're ready to animate this. Bring the playhead to 18 frames. Make sure that shape is selected, come into properties and set a keyframe for the Z position, and in the scale set a keyframe for X and Y. Then bring the playhead back to the start and set the Z rotation at -280 and the X scale value and Y scale value to 0. So now in the keyframe editor, time to play with these curves. I'm just going to do the rotation curve first, so I'll turn off the X and Y scale. Grab the rotation curve and set that to Bezier. break the tangents on these handles, and set the curve to something like this. So the rotation comes out fast and then settles in. So now let's work with these scale curves here. I'll just turn off the rotation. So remember, when we're working with scale, it looks like one curve, but that's the X scale sitting on top of the Y scale in the keyframe editor. I really don't know that much still how it all works, but I'm going to drag to select them both, set the interpolation to Bezier. But now when I grab the handle here to break the tangent, it's going to default that I'm just selecting the X scale. So I'm breaking the tangent there and breaking the tangent here. Now I'm going to select the Y scale and select the node and break the tangents this way. There's probably, or there's definitely a better, more exact way to do that, but I'm just doing the way that I know how now. Alright, so we're all ready to go. I'm going to drag to select them both and give the scale a curve that looks something like this. I'm going to pull this bottom handle back and the top handle this way. And this will give us as close as possible to this source graphic. Right, that'll do us. So the scale and the rotation are finishing on the 18th frame. We want to come forward now to the 20th frame. Come in to make sure the line is the square shape selected, our line path, which is the square shape. Make sure it's selected. Come into the shape panel. With the playhead at 20 frames, set a keyframe for the width. Now bring the playhead forward 1 second, so 1 second 20 frames, and we're going to set the width now to 600. Just checking in the properties panel that everything's centered there. Right, so now we want to play with this curve. I'm just going to turn off everything else in the keyframe editor. So I'm going to grab this curve, right click here, set the interpolation to Bezier and break tangents on these handles, and we're going to give this line the width expansion, something so that it crawls in and then leaps into a stretch and then settles. So something like this. Let's see what we got. Yep, that'll do us. Alright, so we've got the square rotating and scaling in and then expanding. And so now we want from the 1 second 20 frame mark to the 2 second 10 frame mark. So over 20 frames, we want this line now to drop down. So bring the playhead to, leave the playhead at 1 second 20 frames. With the shape selected, come into the shape panel, and here we want this last point offset. So set a keyframe there. Bring the playhead forward 20 frames to 2 seconds 10 frames. And set this value now to 4%. Now if that's giving you a different result, It might be because you drew the line from top to bottom back then, so you'd want to go back and do the line from bottom to top. Otherwise, you could just try working with everything that involves a last point offset, just swap it to the first point offset instead. Right, so now we want to play with this curve here, the outline last point offset, so I'm going to turn off everything. And set the interpolation to Bezier. Break tangents on the handles. And pull this top handle back and pull this bottom handle forward to give us something like that. Okay, and that will do. So let's see what we've got. Okay, so that's that for the first step, and the next step we'll start adding the main titles. Just before we start the titles, let's grab the lead group and the follow group and drag them into that main titles group. Okay, so with the lead group selected, I'll grab the text tool and enter in just these two words, motion graphic, as the main title. So this font is Nimbus Sans condensed. When I'm figuring out these After Effects reproductions, I use various sites online like What the Font and Font Finder to figure out which font's being used. So the result this time was that it's this Nimbus Sans, and I'm quite sure it is the same font as the source graphic. If not, it's very, very close. So I found a free copy of it, and I put the link in for you to go and grab yourself that too. Otherwise, there's other fonts that look pretty similar. So the font size we'll have at 100, tracking at 1, and I'll center the alignment. I'll move the playhead to 20 frames and trim using keyboard shortcut I, trim the text to the playhead there, and I'll just bring the playhead forward to reveal the banner, and I'm going to drag the Y position down so that this graphic sits right to the middle of it. And I'll bring the playhead back to 20 frames, and I'm going to set the X position at -447, and I'll set a keyframe there, and then come forward 1 second to 1 second and 20 frames and set the X position at 0. And I'll come into the keyframe editor and adjust this curve so that the titles rush in and then settle. So I'm just going to review that you don't want this part of the curve to be too fast, otherwise what's going to happen is the titles will speed in and overtake the banner expansion. So something along these lines. That's looking okay. Alright, so with our titles keyframe now, I'm going to grab this shape element, our line path, that is our square. I'm going to right click and add image mask and drop our main titles in there as the source and set that to subtract. So now we'll complete the usual next step for the lead follow masking build. I'm going to grab the title text in the lead group and duplicate that and drag it into the follow group, and I'll just rename this as plain and I'll turn it on. Then I will grab our element from the lead, the square element, our line path, duplicate it, drag that into the follow group, and I'm just going to rename that as the follow shape, delete the image mask. So now I will select the follow group, right click, add image mask, and use that follow shape as the source. But we want to come into properties with that follow shape, and we want to reset all of the keyframing that we set before with the rotation and the scale. I'm going to come to 1 second 20 frames and use I on the keyboard to trim the shape to the playhead, and I'll come into the shape panel in the inspector, and that last point offset, I'm going to reset that parameter. I'm going to grab the last point offset and add a link behavior and use the lead stencil element from our lead group as the source. Here in compatible parameters we want to go to object, shape, outline, last point offset. So now the last point offset is going to, of the follow shape, will follow the last point offset of the lead shape, and I'll come and grab the image mask and set that to subtract. Alright, and I also want to bring the playhead to 1 second and 20 frames. Grab that copy we made of the title text and hit I on my keyboard to trim so that it doesn't show up earlier than we want to see it. So we are done with the main titles now, and our next step is to animate the lower titles. Let's add a new group for the lower titles. And I'll grab the text tool and in all caps, I'm just going to use lower title line. I've changed the font here to Avenue Next Condensed. I couldn't find a free version of the regular font for the Nimbus Sans, so Avenue Next Condensed will do. You should have it available to you by default in Motion 5. I'll center the alignment. I want the font size at 40, the tracking at 5. And for positioning, well, first of all, let's bring the playhead to 2 seconds and 5 frames and hit I on the keyboard to trim. So let's do the positioning just by eye. I'll come into properties and I'll drag the Y value down to about here. With the anchor point unadjusted, I would set the value at Y minus 85, but with the anchor point here, we're sitting at about Y minus 95. So let's just set it to Y at minus 95. Now let's get the keyframing done. So come forward to 3 seconds and 5 frames, and with the X position set to 0, set a keyframe, and then come back 2 seconds and 5 frames, and we want the X position at 115. I'll come down and grab the curve, and let's adjust this as usual for the titles to rush in and then settle into place. Yeah, that's fine. So now we want to add the flourish. And other than figuring out how to manipulate this line path into the square and then the banner and then the line, the other thing that I actually came out learning from this reproduction was the next step we're about to take for building this flourish. So what we want to do is just make sure the lower titles group is selected. Then I'm going to grab the line tool, and with Shift held, I'm going to drag from left to right a line out. It's colored to the same color as the banner, that blue. I'll just rename it as the lower flourish, and I'll bring the playhead to 2 seconds and 5 frames, and hit I on the keyboard to trim that shape here. Right, now I'll come into the inspector, into the shape panel, into geometry, and I'm going to set this at minus 299 and 299, and then come into shape style and give it a width of 54. We'll turn off the start and end caps by setting them to none, and oh yeah, that's looking lined up properly. I'm just going to come into properties and drop the transparency. So I'll turn the opacity down just to help us line it up with the lower title text. So I'm just going to shift it up that way. Alright, so now our lower title is sitting in the middle of this banner here. Okay, so I'll move the opacity up. Okay, so it's time to turn this line path into our sweeping flourish. So our playhead's at 2 seconds and 5 frames. We're going to keyframe the first point offset. So I'll come into the shape panel and grab that first point offset. I'm going to set a keyframe and pull that back to 100%. Now I'm going to bring the playhead forward to 3 seconds and 6 frames. bring that first point offset to 0. Now I'm going to adjust the curve. I'll pull this top handle back and bring this bottom handle right further here. See if I can't get a better view on these. There we go. I'm just checking my notes here that I made earlier to see that I'm getting the right curve. Okay, so yep, that'll do fine. This is the trick that I mentioned before. What we've done, we've set the playhead to 3 seconds and 6 frames and set our curve. So what I'm going to do now is copy this curve, and I'm going to pull the playhead back to 3 seconds 5 frames and drag this keyframe point here back. So we've just shortened this curve by 1 frame. So to set the flourish now, I'm going to bring the playhead back to 2 seconds and 5 frames. Select the last point offset. I'll set a keyframe. I'll right click to select Show in Keyframe Editor. I'm going to select it in the keyframe editor and Ctrl V to paste that curve on. So what we've done is we've given the last point offset a curve that is 1 frame longer than the first point offset. So that should give us our flourish bar running along, which has worked out fine. And now to mask out the lower titles, I'm going to select that lower flourish shape, duplicate it. I'm just going to rename it as the mask. I'm going to reset the first point offset. Let's just give it another color so it's clear what we're doing. So now I'll grab the lower titles text and give them an image mask and drag in the mask we just made as our source and set that to subtract. So now our flourish line will reveal the lower titles on the way in. So we're done with the main graphic, and now we want to set it up so that everything will animate out. So I'm going to bring the playhead to 4 seconds and 5 frames and close up all the groups, and I'll add a new group which I'll call animate in, and I'm going to grab the lower titles group and the main titles group and drag them in there, and I've just hit O on the keyboard to trim everything back to 4 seconds and 5 frames. So now I will select that animate in group, right click and select make clone layer. So with the clone layer selected, I'll use the shift left bracket shortcut to move the in point so that the clone layer begins right where our animated graphic animate in group finishes. And if you don't see it available in properties, the timing section, if it's not showing, just click around here to reveal it and set that to reverse. So now everything should animate in and then animate out. And so to finish up, I'll just turn motion blur on. Run a RAM preview. I've actually found that using motion blur with this particular one actually, I think, kind of detracts, makes it look less like the source graphic. So that is it. We finished the 10th After Effects title graphic reproduction. The next one, number 11, I'm going to go back to the source graphic source and do another one that's in there by the motion designer who I got this one from. Hey, I hope you learned something useful in here for your Final Cut Pro and Motion projects. Thanks for watching.